Thank you for watching us on YouTube. But did you know that if you're on the go, you can get the full show as a podcast now? You can get our morning breakdown of the most important topics facing our country, news not being covered by the mainstream media, interviews with change-making progressives, and info on what you can actually do about all this. Search for The Damage Report on your favorite podcast app and subscribe so you know when new episodes are ready to go. It's been a long road through these primaries, but we've still got one left. That's tonight, New York, potentially one of the most significant with some of the highest profile races and extremely consequential races there, especially in the case of Andrew Cuomo versus Cynthia Nixon. Depending on who wins, that is a massive direction shift for New York that could send reverberations throughout the country. Joining us now to break down these primaries and the fight over the future of the Democratic Party is David Sirota, a journalist at Capital in Maine and columnist for The Guardian as well. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So I have a lot that I want to talk to you about, but I was given a prop at the beginning, and I just want to see your response because I know you're very interested not just in the different sorts of politicians we have, the more establishment corporate, Democrats, progressive challengers, but also how the media approaches those things. Had you seen this Time cover, The Persistence of Nancy Pelosi?
I have seen it, yes.
What did you think of that?
Well, Nancy Pelosi has been around for a long time. Nancy Pelosi didn't leave her position when the Democrats lost the House. And so I guess in a sense, in a literal sense, that is persistence. The question for the Democrats is after you lose epically the elections that they lost and lost the House, why are the same leaders basically running the show for the Democrats in the House? And in my Guardian column, I talk a little bit about how Nancy Pelosi, even now, is setting the parameters for how the Democrats will behave should they win back the majority. She's saying that single-payer Medicare for all shouldn't be a litmus test for the party's candidates. She's also saying essentially that budget austerity measures, budget cutting, will govern the way Democrats put forward policy. Not exactly progressive or really, I would say, inspiring messages from the House Democratic leader on the eve of what people are calling the most important midterm elections in a long time.
And it really feels to me like just the latest perfect example of the pattern we've had several times in our country where a Republican gets into office, passes massive tax cuts requiring budget priorities to be shifted. So then the Democrat wins because of frustration over the tax cuts, and then they do the work of cutting progressive priorities and not pushing for things that people actually support. So that's frustrating, although I guess not new in America.
It's almost like the fix is in, right? And to be frank, I think the fix is in. What we see from our politics right now is essentially a consensus. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about polarization. Oh, the parties are so far apart. But in fact, when you look at policies, many of the policies that the government is dealing with, there is a bipartisan consensus. And we see a bipartisan consensus around budget austerity, cutting social programs. The government supposedly can't be too big. But of course, that principle both parties believe in policy and in their votes doesn't seem to apply to the Pentagon or to endless war. And so the question now is, are we at a moment where the public is so sick of that consensus that the public is going to start electing people who really explicitly challenge that consensus?
Shivala?
Hi, David. It's Shivala. So by all kind of punditry, by all accounts of punditry, the House is looking to flip, but the question is by how much. Isn't that going to reinforce the fix that you were just talking about? Everybody's fear is kind of this will not embolden the progressive wing of the party. It will just have like 2 steps forward, like 3 steps back.
Well, I don't necessarily think so because of this. I think if the Democrats take back the House, there are going to be a group of progressive Democrats, some of them who've been there for a while, others who are poised to win elections after winning tough primaries, who can, in the majority, challenge their own party. I mean, you will have a voting bloc of Democrats in the House, newly elected, with more senior progressive members from the Progressive Caucus, who I think will be in a position to really exert their power. Now, the big question will be, after the election, will they actually go forward and do that? And that, I think, is a question about those specific members of Congress, but it's also that deeper question of whether the public that has been engaged in this election will continue to be engaged after the election. We have seen so many times in the past, especially on the Democratic side, where Democratic politicians will get elected and then the voting wave that elected them into office isn't at their throats, holding their feet to the fire all the time on a day-to-day basis. We most, I think, pronounced saw that explicitly in 2008. Obama wins with this huge mandate, and then there was sort of an attitude of, the Democrats in Congress will now fix everything, and we don't necessarily have to keep the pressure on. And what ended up happening out of that was there was a health care bill that was passed with no public option, and single payer was basically off the table. You had a stimulus package that wasn't nearly big enough to adequately do what many people thought it needed to do. You had weak financial regulations. And I think the point there is that you can't just rely on casting a vote and then walking away and hoping that the good people you cast a vote for are going to ultimately execute on the good things that they promised. There's a big gap between the promises and the actual delivery.
So I know that a good amount of your work and your focus recently has been on New York politics. New York is a particularly corrupt, weird, old school version of democratic politics in terms of the machine they've set up there. So tonight we've got several big races. Obviously Cynthia Nixon versus Andrew Cuomo, but there's also Jumaane Williams and Zephyr Teachout. I guess in a larger view, in the primaries that we've had, how significant would you rate these particular primaries? And if Cynthia Nixon, if Zephyr Teachout were able to win, how big of a reaction do you think that would send throughout the media and the rest of the country?
Well, look, the primary contests in New York are hugely important, and they're hugely important for a lot of reasons. One, New York is just a giant state with a huge economy, so policies that pass in New York can have national and international ramifications. If New York became the first state to have single payer, first of all, it's positioned to be able to actually do that. It's got the financial wherewithal to do that, and secondly, it would create a national model, and it could do all sorts of things that much smaller states couldn't do. So the elections, statewide elections in New York, are inherently important, particularly at the attorney general level, because the attorney general is the attorney general that oversees Wall Street and is empowered to investigate Wall Street. And Donald Trump's empire is based in New York, so the attorney general there is also empowered to investigate the shenanigans around the Trump corporate empire. The problem in New York, or at least one of the problems, is that it's very hard for insurgent progressive candidates to win because the system is rigged in a way that's not necessarily even rigged in other states. I mean, we have a generally rigged political system in the United States, and in New York, it's like the worst of the worst. It's very difficult to register to vote, to switch your registration to vote. You have to do it months beforehand, before an election. There are questions about whether there are enough polling stations. There are reports about polling stations not being open until 12 noon. Meanwhile, you have to raise an absolutely enormous amount of money to campaign around that state because it's such a large state. You have LLC loopholes that allow LLCs to funnel money to corporate candidates in ways that they're not necessarily able to do in other states. So the primaries are really important. The Attorney General primary with Zephyr Teachout, that is a hugely important primary. The governorship, I mean, all of these primaries are big, but I think the point I'm making here is that let's really understand how much of an uphill climb it is against the entrenched Democratic machine. I think there's a good chance that some of these insurgent candidates can win, but I don't think we should look at if they don't win. You can't look at it and say, oh, this is a complete failure for the progressive movement. I mean, this is an enormously uphill battle. The fact that these are even close contests in the polls is already an amazing achievement, I think.
David, in the piece you talk about how one of the big drumbeats of the progressive candidates and progressive wing of the party is single payer. And for the more establishment ones, the narrative is, listen, we built Obamacare and the Republicans just need to stop messing with it. And that is a false narrative. And can you just kind of talk through that? Because I think for a lot of people that aren't living inside and following, the horse race so in such a detailed way, it feels like the second act of a battle that's already completely convoluted.
Right. So look, Obamacare passed. The Obama administration helped kill the public option. Single payer, by the administration's own admission, was effectively omitted from the entire policy debate back then. And what we've seen is that there have been incremental improvements to the healthcare system in the sense of making sure people can't be thrown off of their private insurance if they have a pre-existing condition. This was basically modest private insurance reform, if you're being really honest about Obamacare, and there was an expansion of Medicaid. These are important things, but these are incremental things. And I think that what has happened is that over the last 10 years, people the American public has realized that, yes, we support those incremental reforms because they're the barest minimum kinds of things that should be done in a humane society. But the healthcare crisis has continued. Skyrocketing premiums. You still have insurance companies at the center of the healthcare delivery system, in between patients and their doctors. Look, and so what's gone on is that you've now seen polls showing a huge increase in support for Medicare for all, and that's not surprising. People who are on Medicare, as the surveys show, are much more happy with their health care than people who don't get Medicare. That's not surprising. The Medicare system is not perfect, but it is a guaranteed system. It has lower cost of doing business, administrative costs. So it's not surprising that now you see polls where the public is saying we support this idea. And even Barack Obama recently gave a speech saying he thinks Medicare for all is now a good idea. Now, he's characterized it as a new idea, I think, because he doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that it's an old idea that he one time as a candidate used to support. He used to support single payer, but it doesn't really, you can go back and nail him for that. But I think the point is that the public has shifted. Now, the question is whether blue states in particular, but everywhere in general, whether they're going to elect Democrats who are serious about legislating single payer and or Medicare for all, that kind of system, or whether those Democrats are going to continue legislating health care policies that appease the donor class, appease the private insurance industry, the drug industry, the hospital industry, all of the industries that are invested in the current system. And so I think when we get to this election, are there going to be enough Democrats who get elected campaigning for Medicare for all and then who deliver on those campaign promises? And watching that gap, that old saying, mind the gap between the promises and the actions once these people get into office.
Yeah. Well, hopefully with the new Medicare for All caucus and a certainly larger, hopefully much larger progressive caucus, we might actually see that. Well, David Sirota, a journalist for Capital Maine, thank you so much for joining us, especially on the eve of these incredibly important primaries.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for watching this clip from The Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notified of our new videos. And catch The Damage Report every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.